There is a valley in the mountains of Central Asia where the old shepherds still will not sleep alone, not because of wolves, not because of the cold, but because of what their grandfathers told them about the last man who kept company with something that did not belong to this age of the world, and what that something said before the soldiers came. This is not a legend, or rather, it is not only a legend, because the details are too specific, the geography is too precise, the soldier records are too consistent, and the thing that was seen, the being that spoke and warned and was never found again, left traces in the ground that modern excavation equipment has never fully explained. This is the story of the last shepherd who watched flocks with a giant, and what the giant said before the soldiers found them. If you are the kind of person who watches until the end of videos like this, make sure you are subscribed, turn on notifications, because what we are building here, this archive of things they decided not to teach you, is only going to go deeper from here. Leave a comment below with the words, "I remember," if this is your first time on this channel. We want to know how many of you are waking up. In the official history of the 19th century, the Eurasian steppe was empty. A vast, windswept corridor of grass and stone, a geographic blank between the civilizations of China and Europe, crossed occasionally by traders on the Silk Road, but otherwise unmemorable, irrelevant to the grand story of human development. The nomads who lived there were classified as primitive, their oral traditions were classified as folklore, their accounts of what they had seen in the deep valleys and the high passes were classified as superstition. And then, in 1886, a Russian imperial surveyor named Dmitry Vasilenko filed a report that no one has ever officially explained. He had been mapping the foothills of the Altai Range, the mountain system that forms the border between what is now Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China, when his team was approached by a local herdsman. The herdsman was Kazakh, a man in his 60s whose name Vasilenko recorded phonetically as Ibek. And Ibek told him something that Vasilenko, to his credit, wrote down in full despite his obvious discomfort with the material. He told him about his father. His father had been a shepherd in the same valley 60 years earlier, which places the events Ibek described somewhere around 1826. His father had grazed his flocks in a high summer pasture that local people called the Plateau of the Old Ones, a name, Ibek explained, that referred not to ancestral human graves, but to something else. Something that the valley people believed had lived in those mountains since before the memory of any living tradition. His father had seen one, not from a distance, not as a silhouette against the sky or a shape in the mist. He had met it. He had shared a fire with it for 7 nights. He had listened to it speak. And on the 8th morning, a unit of Russian military surveyors had arrived at the plateau, and the being had walked into the mountain and not come back. Vasilenko wrote all of this down. He included it in his report. And then, somewhere between the field office in Barnaul and the Imperial Archive in St. Petersburg, that section was removed. What arrived in the official record was a geographic survey of the Altai foothills with no mention of Abek, no mention of the Plateau of the Old Ones, and no mention of anything a shepherd's father might have seen there 60 years before. But Vasilenko kept a personal journal, and the journal survived. It was found in 2003 inches, a private collection in Novosibirsk by a researcher named Alexei Danilov, working on a history of imperial-era cartography. Danilov recognized that what he was reading was not a folklore transcription. Vasilenko was a trained engineer, skeptical by professional formation, and yet what he wrote about Ibek's account is careful, precise, and completely without the dismissive framing you would expect from a 19th century Russian bureaucrat encountering what he would have considered native superstition. He believed him, or rather, he believed that Abek believed, and that Abek's father had not been lying and had not been dreaming, and had not been describing an ordinary man encountered in an ordinary way, in an ordinary summer, on an ordinary mountain. Let us go back to 1826. Let us go back to the plateau and the fire and the 7 nights and try to understand what the shepherd's father actually experienced. His name, according to Ibek's account as recorded by Vasilenko, was Maksat. He was a young man at the time, probably in his early 20s, responsible for moving his family's sheep to the high summer pasture while the men dealt with a dispute in the lowland settlement. He had done this route before. He knew the plateau, the path through the pine forest and the scree fields, the flat granite shelf where the grass grew thick and the spring never dried, even in drought years. What he did not expect was that the spring would be occupied. Not occupied in the way that another herdsman might occupy it, with a tent and a rope line and cooking smells drifting on the air, occupied in a different way. occupied by a presence that he felt before he saw it, a stillness in the air around the water source, a quality of waiting, as if the rocks themselves were holding something in. He almost turned the sheep around. Later, he would tell his son that he wished he had not, because what he found was dangerous, but because once you have seen something that honest, you cannot unsee it, and the world becomes a smaller and sadder place afterward. What he found at the spring was a man, except not a man in any proportion he had ever encountered, not a giant in the way that stories describe giants, no club, no rage, no thunderous footstep, just a being of extraordinary size, seated beside the spring with its knees drawn up and its arms resting across them and its face turned toward the water as if it had been sitting there for a very long time and had no particular intention of stopping. Maksat estimated the height later, when it stood, at somewhere between 11 and 13 feet. The proportions were human. The face was human, not monstrous, not distorted, not the face of a creature from a nightmare, but the face of something old and quiet and exhausted in a way that made Maksat feel, absurdly, that he wanted to ask if it needed anything. The skin was the color of deep river clay, a reddish-brown Maksat had not seen on any person before. The hair was white, not with age, but with a whiteness that seemed natural, like the white of a mountain birch. The eyes, when the being eventually looked at him, were the detail that stayed with Maksat for the rest of his life, pale grey-green, like water over limestone, and they were not surprised to see him. That is the detail that matters, because everything in Maksat's account circles back to that absence of surprise. The being had been waiting not for Maksat specifically, but in the patient, structural way that very old things wait when they have learned that time is not an emergency. It had known that someone would come to this spring eventually. It had decided to stay until that happened, and when a young shepherd arrived with his sheep and stood frozen at the edge of the water looking up at it, it simply looked back and waited for him to decide. He stayed. He would never be fully able to explain why. He was frightened, he was honest about that, but the fear had nowhere to go. There was nothing to run from. The being made no move toward him. It simply sat beside the spring with a quality of such complete stillness that after a while the sheep stopped huddling at the far edge and began to graze, which Maksat took as a sign that his instincts had not been entirely wrong to stay. The first night they were on opposite sides of the fire. Maksat had built the fire his own materials, and the being had watched him do it with an expression he could only describe as recognition, as if it knew what fire was, as if it had known for a very long time, and found in the act of someone building one a kind of comfort it had not felt in a while. It did not eat, it did not sleep, as far as Maksat could tell. It sat on its side of the fire and watched the flames, and occasionally looked up at the sky with an attention that Maksat slowly understood was not casual stargazing, but something more like reading. It was tracking something specific. And whatever it was looking for, it was not finding it, because over the 7 nights the expression with which it scanned the sky became progressively more still, more settled into a resignation that made Maksat deeply uncomfortable without knowing why. The speaking began on the 3rd night. Not in Kazakh, not in Russian, not in any language that Maksat recognized, and Maksat knew several. What the being spoke was something else. A language that sounded like the way rivers talk to each other when 2 tributaries meet, a blending, a layering, sounds that came from a chest so large that they arrived in the air with a physical weight to them. And yet Maksat understood it. This is the point in the account where the skeptical mind reaches for the obvious explanations. Dreams, fever, the hallucinatory quality that high altitude and isolation can produce in a young man sleeping alone in the mountains. These are reasonable proposals. And Vasilenko, an educated man of his era, made all of them in his journal before crossing them out and writing simply, "The internal consistency of this account across 60 years of transmission, from a man who had no motive to fabricate, is more remarkable than the alternative." Maksat understood the being because the being wanted to be understood. The language was not a language in the way that Kazakh is a language, a system agreed upon by speakers, but something more fundamental. Something that reached directly into the part of the mind that knows what warmth means before it knows the word for fire. What the being told him across those 4 nights of speaking was not a narrative. It moved in circles, coming back to certain images and meanings, with a repetition that Maksat understood was not redundancy, but emphasis. These things matter. These things especially matter. Come back to these. So let us circle through what Maksat reported hearing, what Ibek recorded remembering, what Vasilenko committed to his private journal, and what Danilov found in 2003 and understood with the advantage of a century and a half of subsequent strangeness as something possibly very different from folklore. The being said that it remembered when this mountain was not a mountain. It said this clearly enough that Maksat understood it was not speaking metaphorically. Not, "I remember when this place felt different," or "I remember when the people here were different," but literally, "I remember when the geological formation you are now standing on did not exist in this configuration. I was here before the folding. I watched the stone come up." If we take this at face value, and let us at least entertain the experiment of taking it at face value, we are looking at a claimed lifespan that predates the Altai mountain range in anything like its current form. What this means in terms of its relationship to this world as something that had watched it change, repeatedly, catastrophically, from a vantage point of direct presence, is something we should sit with. The being said that there had been a civilization before the one that Maksat's people called ancient. Not a little before, not a century or a dynasty, a deep before that, the being described with an image of layers of stone, each one resting on top of something older, each one covering what came before it. It said that the civilization Maksat's people called their history the sequence running from the oldest empires they knew of, backward to the first cities they had names for, was not the beginning. It was one of the recent layers. There were older ones beneath. Many older ones. This is where the Tartaria connection becomes impossible to ignore. Because what the Tartaria research community has been documenting for decades, working outside the institutions, working from physical evidence that the official archaeology has repeatedly failed to account for, is exactly this. A civilization underneath the civilization. A world beneath the world we have been taught to call the beginning. The word Tartaria does not appear in Maksat's account as Vasilenko recorded it. Ibeck did not use it. The being the shepherd described did not use it, as far as we can know. But the geography, the cosmology, the specific insistence on a prior civilization of enormous scale and sophistication that existed in Central Asia and the Eurasian heartland before the world was reorganized into the form we now recognize, all of this maps precisely onto what the Tartaria hypothesis proposes as the buried truth beneath the official history. What was Tartaria? In the mainstream record, it is a name Tartary, Great Tartary. Grand Tartary applied loosely by European mapmakers from the 13th through the 18th centuries to the vast interior of Asia that lay beyond their direct knowledge. On old maps, you can find it labelled across an enormous region, from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, from the northern forests to the Himalayas, a name for what they did not understand, a placeholder for the unknown interior. But there is another reading. What if Tartary was not a name for ignorance? What if it was a name for something that actually existed? A civilization of continental scale, centrally organized, technologically sophisticated, in ways we have systematically misattributed to later cultures, that occupied the Eurasian interior for thousands of years before being erased. Not erased by the slow erosion of time and climate, but erased deliberately removed from the maps and the records and the institutional memory as a matter of policy by the same empires simultaneously expanding into the territories it had once occupied. The evidence for this is not small. It is a pattern of architectural similarity across a geographic range too vast for independent development, a pattern of construction techniques for which we have no adequate explanatory timeline, a pattern of structures that appear in places where the populations available to build them should not have been able to build them, using materials and methods we attribute to a later period that keep appearing, stubbornly, attached to dates the official chronology cannot absorb without discomfort. The mud flood hypothesis, which circulates widely in Tartaria research communities, proposes that a catastrophic event, or series of events, occurred in the 18th and possibly early 19th century, that buried the structures of this prior civilization under meters of sediment, leaving only their upper floors and decorative facades visible above the new ground level, and that the populations that moved into these semi-buried structures afterward were told, or simply assumed, that they had been built recently by people very much like themselves. You can find this hypothesis illustrated with photographs of buildings across Europe and Asia, where the ground floor windows are below street level, where staircases descend into what should be basements but show signs of original habitation, where the architectural ornamentation stops abruptly at a stratum that corresponds to a certain date, and the stonework below that stratum is of a quality and complexity that the recorded history of the region cannot account for. Maksat's being, whatever it was, said that the civilization it remembered was not built by the people who later claimed it. This is perhaps the most extraordinary element of the account. It did not say the prior civilization built the mountains or the stone formations. It was specific. It said the structures, the buildings, the things made of cut stone and shaped metal and fired earth that were already present in the landscape when the people who would later call themselves the inheritors of Central Asia arrived in it. They did not build what they found. They moved into it. They adapted it. They told stories about it that eventually became foundation myths. And over enough generations, the adaptation became indistinguishable from the original, and the original became invisible not because it had disappeared, but because it had been absorbed so completely that no one thought to ask where it had come from. The being said it had watched this happen. Not once. Multiple times. The same cycle, across different scales. A civilization reaches a certain capacity. Something enormous and fast, geological or atmospheric, or both, simultaneously resets the surface conditions. The survivors move into what they find. They fill the structures of the civilization that preceded them. They call it home. And after enough time, they call it theirs. And the beings like the one Maksat was speaking to, the ones who remembered, were left in the mountains, in the high places the resets never quite reached, watching. There were not many of them left. This is when the shepherd's account takes on its most human quality, because the being told him it was the last one in this range. That others had gone somewhere else, or gone somewhere not navigable by ordinary space, or simply stopped, and that word, stopped, carried a weight of grief in it that crossed whatever barrier separated this being from the young man on the other side of the fire. It was alone. It had been alone for a very long time, and it had stayed in the mountains not because it could not leave, but because leaving meant letting go of the last thread of witness. If it went, there would be no one left who remembered what this land had looked like before, no one who could hold the before and the after in a single memory. The whole vast catastrophe of transformation, the buried cities, the reset civilizations, would be finally and completely unwitnessed. So it had stayed, for longer than Maksat had any framework to calculate. It had stayed and watched and waited beside the spring where the water had always come from the same deep source, even as everything above ground was reorganized into new configurations. And now it was speaking to a shepherd. Why? Maksat asked this. Abek remembered him asking it. Even across 60 years and the imperfect channel of transmission, the question came through with a kind of desperate clarity. Why now? Why me? What is it that you need a shepherd to know? The being said, because the soldiers are coming. Not as a threat, not with anger or warning in the punitive sense, just as information, the calm transfer of a fact. The soldiers are coming, and when they come, I will not be here. And when I am not here, this conversation will be the only record of what I told you. And what I told you matters. What did it tell him that mattered? 3 things. 3 specific things that Maksat, across decades of subsequent life, a life lived in the lowland settlements, a life of ordinary herding and trading and aging, repeated to his son with a regularity that suggested he had never stopped thinking about them. The first. Beneath the foundation stones of the structure that the valley people called the Old Temple, a ruin in the lower reaches of the range, that everyone assumed was a shrine of some pre-Islamic religious tradition, a place that the local population respected but did not investigate, there was a chamber, sealed. Not collapsed, not fallen in, but sealed by intention, by engineering, by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted what was inside to survive. The being did not say what was inside. Maksat, characteristically, did not ask. What the being said was that it was there, that it had always been there, and that the time for its unsealing would be recognizable, because the people who found it would have, by that point, run out of other explanations. The second thing, the water. The spring on the plateau, the one beside which they were having this conversation, was not a spring in the geological sense. Or rather it was, but it was a spring, because it had been made into one. The aquifer it fed from had been channeled, deliberately, by a hydraulic system of enormous extent that ran under the entire mountain range, and that system was still functioning, still actively managed. Not by the beings like the one speaking to Maksat, they had not maintained it. It had been built to maintain itself. It was running on the inertia of its own original construction, and it would continue to run for as long as the mountain held its shape, which was, by any human measure, effectively forever. This is a claim that sounds on first encounter like fantasy, but it becomes less comfortable when you set it beside the documented anomalies of water behavior in the Altai region, the springs that appear at elevations where standard hydrological modeling cannot fully account for them, the water sources, reported consistently at the same locations across centuries, the underground river systems mapped in the 19th century during the same imperial survey expeditions that produced the redacted Vasilenko report, Systems whose origin points have never been satisfactorily explained. Who built them? When? With what technology? The official answer is that they are natural formations, shaped by tectonic activity and glacial movement over geological time. And perhaps they are. But the being beside the fire in 1826 told a shepherd that they were not, and Vasilenko, who had spent his career mapping terrain, wrote in his journal that Ibex's description of the water on that plateau was consistent with what his own survey instruments had found pressure and flow patterns that did not match the local geology. The third thing the being told him was the hardest to transmit. It was about time. Not time in the sense of duration, not a calendar or a clock. Time in the sense of what it actually is, which the being apparently believed was not what the people of Maksat's civilization had decided it was. It spoke about this with an urgency that was the only urgency in the entire 7 nights, the one moment when the deep patience broke and something almost desperate came through. Maksat tried to convey this to Ibex for years without finding words that worked. What he eventually settled on was an image. The being described time the way you would describe a river if you had only ever lived beside a river, and then suddenly discovered that the river was not a river at all, but a road. That what you experienced as a current carrying you forward was actually a surface you were standing on. That the movement was not the river's, the movement had always been yours. What this means in practical terms, what its implications are for the buried civilization, the reset cycle, the structures under the structures, Maksat never fully articulated, and the being apparently never made explicit. It was a frame, not a map. A way of seeing, not a set of instructions. But it is worth sitting with, because the Tartaria hypothesis, in its most developed form, is not only about buildings and maps and mud floods. It is also about the timeline itself, the possibility that the chronology we have been given is not accurate. Not wrong in the sense of small errors and revised dates, but structurally wrong. Built on a premise about when things happen that does not match the physical record, maintained by institutions whose entire authority rests on that premise remaining unchallenged. The being told Maksat that time was not what he thought it was, and then the soldiers came. They arrived on the morning of the 8th day. Not as an attack, they were surveyors in their official capacity, part of the same imperial mapping effort that eventually produced Vasilenko's expedition a generation later. They came over the ridge from the eastern approach, 6 men in uniform with instruments and weapons, and the particular purposeful efficiency of people conducting official business in a place where official business had recently decided it had an interest. Maksat heard them before he saw them. He turned toward the sound, and when he turned back, the being was standing. He had not seen it stand before. For 7 nights it had sat, and now it was upright, and the full scale of it was suddenly and completely real. 11 feet, 12. The white hair falling to shoulders as wide as a doorframe. The grey-green eyes already moving toward the ridge, already reading the incoming soldiers with that same sky-reading attention it had given the stars, looking for something specific and finding in the answer the beginning of departure. It looked down at Maksat, and Maksat, who had spent 7 nights in the company of something ancient and enormous and alone, found that he was crying. He had not planned to cry. He was a young man in the mountains, with a practical relationship with his emotions. But the being looked down at him with those water-over-limestone eyes, and something in the quality of the look, final, grateful, entirely without regret, broke whatever composure he had been maintaining. The being did not comfort him. It simply looked, and then it turned toward the mountain face behind the spring, the sheer granite wall that Maksat had spent 7 days treating as the permanent boundary of his small world, and walked toward it, and then into it. Not through a crack or a crevice. Into the solid face of the mountain, with the same unhurried deliberateness it had brought to everything else. The granite closed behind it like water. The soldiers came over the ridge. They found a shepherd and his sheep, and a cold fire beside a spring. They asked if he had seen anything unusual. He said no. They surveyed the plateau and made their notes and left. And Maksat sat beside the spring for a long time after they were gone, looking at the wall of granite through which something vast and old had walked, and tried to understand what he was supposed to do with everything he now knew. He went home. He became the person he had always been going, to be an ordinary man with ordinary responsibilities and an extraordinary memory that he carried inside his ordinary life for decades, like a stone that has been swallowed, smooth and heavy and permanent. He told his son told the Russian surveyor. The Russian surveyor told his journal. The journal survived. The question that the Tartaria research community keeps returning to is the question of the witness. Who was here before the official history began? Who remembers the world before the reset? The answer that the mainstream offers is no one. No one old enough. No continuous human tradition reaching back past the beginning of recorded history. And recorded history, by definition, begins at the edge of what the institutions are willing to recognize as reliable testimony. But what if there were others? Beings of a different order of duration, for whom the span we call ancient history is recent, for whom the civilization we cannot find evidence of is simply the last time they watched something built and then buried. What if the high places the ranges and plateaus where ordinary civilization never quite took full hold, where the official record has always been spottiest, were occupied by remnants of a memory older than any human institution? This is what Maxat's account proposes. And the specific details, the hydraulic system, the sealed chamber, the way the being moved through granite, are not the details of a man fabricating for his descendants. They are the details of a man reporting what he saw as precisely as his language allowed, knowing he would never be fully believed, choosing to pass it on because the alternative was silence. Vasilenko believed him. He wrote in his journal, in the careful hand of a trained engineer, "I find that I cannot construct a satisfying objection to this account that does not require me to dismiss the testimony entirely, and the testimony is too consistent to dismiss. Whatever this man's father saw beside that spring, it was not nothing. Whatever it was, it is not nothing." The Tartaria hypothesis, at its deepest level, is not about ancient architecture or lost maps. It is about memory, the necessity of witness, the necessity of someone who stayed, who watched the mountain rise and the cities sink and the civilizations reset and the survivors adapt and the adaptations harden into orthodoxies, who stayed through all of it, so that at some moment, beside some fire, in some high pasture, it could sit across from an ordinary person and say, "It was not always like this. There was something else. It was here. I was here." The valley in the Altai where Vasilenko conducted his survey has since been included in the territory of the Russian Federation. Several researchers in the post-Soviet period who attempted to locate the specific plateau described in Vasilenko's journal encountered consistent bureaucratic friction in the permitting process, and a team that did reach the area in 2011 reported that their GPS equipment behaved anomalously throughout their time on the high ground, not failing exactly, but producing location readings that did not correspond to their known position by a margin consistent enough to seem deliberate. The spring is still there. The water is still coming from somewhere. The granite wall above the spring shows no obvious passage. But the rock around it, in photographs the 2011 team managed to take before their camera equipment began producing similar anomalies to their GPS, shows a crystalline structure that one team member, a geologist, described as inconsistent with the standard formation profile of the surrounding range, as if, in a small area, the granite is different, as if in a specific place on the face of a specific mountain, the stone has been worked by something that did not use any tool the geologist had a category for. No official investigation has been conducted. The informal report circulates in Tartaria research communities and has been dismissed by institutional geology as amateur error in difficult conditions, which may be exactly right, and which also may be exactly the kind of explanation that sounds complete until you sit with it long enough that its seams begin to show. What did the giant say before the soldiers found them? It said the structures are under the structures. It said the water was made, not found. It said time is a road you walk, not a river that carries you. It said I remember when this was not a mountain. It said there was something here before what you call ancient, and it is still here, waiting in the layers, waiting for the people who find it to have run out of other explanations. And then it walked into the mountain, and the soldiers came over the ridge, and the shepherd dried his face and told them he had seen nothing unusual, and carried what he knew for the rest of his life like a stone he had swallowed, smooth and heavy and permanent, and eventually it became the thing you just heard. Is it true? Is it the kind of true that the institutions will one day be forced to acknowledge, or the kind that will continue to live in journals and informal reports and research communities and the memories of people who watch until the end of videos like this one? We don't know yet. The chamber under the old temple ruin has not been excavated. The hydraulic system under the Altai range has not been formally mapped. The granite wall above the spring has not been analysed by anyone whose findings would change anything. But the water is still coming from somewhere. It has always come from somewhere. And the question of where, and who made the path it travels, and how long ago, and what else was made at the same time, these are not questions that have been answered. They are questions that have been avoided. Which is a different thing entirely. The shepherd went home. The being went into the mountain. the journal survived. And somewhere in the Altai range, at an elevation above the official record and below the attention of the institutions that maintain it, a spring still flows from a source that no standard hydrological model can quite account for, and the granite above it catches the light at certain angles in a way that makes the stone look, for just a moment, like something that was not always a wall. Maybe it was always a wall. Maybe it wasn't.